Hey guys, tonight we're setting off on a very slow trip. No luggage required, no passport checks, and thankfully no actual walking through deserts. Which is good, because historically, the Silk Road was more sand-in-your-shoes misery than romantic caravans under the stars. So dim the lights, make sure you've got a blanket, let your brain loosen up a little. We're going to drift back in time, across centuries, across empires, across some very questionable Tamils. Because tonight, we're going to wander down the so-called Silk Road. Now, right from the start, let's get one thing straight. The Silk Road was not a road. Not even close. You weren't going to open Google Maps in 300 BC and find a nice straight dotted line saying, "Go left at Samarkand, then continue for 4,000 miles." No. It was more like a giant, messy web of caravan trails, side routes, bandit detours, and please don't die of thirst in this desert pathways. It sprawled from China all the way to the Mediterranean, connecting empires that would have happily ignored each other, except that everybody really wanted silk. And spices. And occasionally, horses. But before silk became the diva commodity, let's float back to the world before it existed in Europe. Imagine it. The Mediterranean elites, draped in their itchy linens and wool. Rome wasn't even Rome yet. Persia was busy being Persia. And somewhere far away in China, worms were being domesticated into tiny little factories of luxury. And honestly, whoever first decided to boil worm spit cocoons into threads of shimmering fabric, well, that person deserves some kind of ancient Nobel Prize for most unexpected fashion innovation. Because silk wasn't just a fabric. It was basically liquid status. If you were wearing silk in 200 BC Rome, you weren't just rich. You were, oh, he probably has opinions about wine temperatures, rich. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before the Silk Road was a thing, the regions it would later connect were like teenagers at a bad school dance, standing around awkwardly, pretending not to notice each other, and occasionally throwing punches when forced to interact. China was in its warring states phase, which is exactly what it sounds like: endless war, lots of pointy hats, and a constant stream of philosophers writing about how everyone should maybe stop stabbing each other so much. Meanwhile, Persia had already been through a couple of empires, and the Mediterranean was still warming up for its big Roman moment. The point is, nobody really knew about each other. Europe had no clue that China existed. China, for its part, wasn't exactly thinking, you know who needs some shimmering worm cloth? Julius Caesar. They were too busy arguing over Confucianism versus legalism. But slowly, very slowly, trade routes started forming. People on the edges of each empire traded with their neighbors, who traded with their neighbors, who traded with theirs, and eventually, a spice from India might end up in Babylon, or a horse from Central Asia might make it to China. Nobody walked the whole thing. That's a modern misconception. Traders weren't marathon runners. They did short hops. They sold their goods, someone else carried them further, and on it went like the most inefficient Amazon Prime delivery system imaginable. And then, silk entered the chat. Now, the Chinese had figured out silk production by around 2700 BC, if we believe their legends. Supposedly, Empress Lezu, wife of the Yellow Emperor, was sipping tea under a mulberry tree when, plop, a cocoon fell in her cup. It unraveled in the hot water, and suddenly she was like, worm spit string. Fashion opportunity. Because, of course, she was. Realistically, it probably wasn't quite that cinematic, but by the Shang dynasty, silk weaving was a solid industry. And the Chinese guarded the secret like it was nuclear codes. If you tried to smuggle silkworms or their eggs out of China, the punishment was death. Which sounds dramatic, but given how much money silk brought in, you can kind of see their point. So for centuries, China was the only silk source on Earth, and they weren't telling anyone how it worked. Which meant that once silk started leaking out of China through trade, it became the ultimate exotic flex. Romans couldn't get enough of it. And that's where the story of the Silk Road really kicks into gear. But before we get into the Roman obsession, let's pause for a second on the middle part. Because between China and Rome, you've got Central Asia, which, to be honest, was less civilization and more endless grassland with a side of scary horsemen. Steppe nomads basically owned that space, and they were very good at riding horses, raiding neighbors, and deciding who got to pass through, which made them the unofficial toll collectors of ancient globalization. You wanted your silk to get through, you either made deals with them, or you didn't. And if you didn't, well, good luck with that. This is where horses become part of the story. Chinese silk was great, but Chinese horses were, frankly, kind of disappointing. Small, scrappy, not really up to warhorse standards. Meanwhile, Central Asia had these big, muscular beasts known as the heavenly horses. And of course, the Chinese wanted them. Because once you've seen a nomad galloping at you on a massive horse, you start questioning your own stables. So deals were struck. Silk went west, horses came east, nomads got rich, and bandits got richer. Let's float forward a little now. Around the 2nd century BC, China finally decided to stop being a hermit and officially open up trade westward. This was under the Han Dynasty, which, if you remember your dynasties, was one of the big ones. The Han Emperor sent a guy named Zhang Chen out to explore what was beyond the western deserts. Zhang Chen basically had the world's worst business trip. Captured by nomads, held hostage for a decade, escaped, got captured again, and still came back like, yeah, I've got a PowerPoint presentation for you. What he discovered, aside from trauma, was that there were entire civilizations out there who might want to trade. And that kicked off what we now call the Silk Road proper. From here, silk began trickling west in larger and larger amounts. It made it to Persia, it made it to India, eventually it made it to Rome. And that's where things get fun. Because Romans loved silk. They loved it too much. Senators started complaining that silk was ruining Roman morals, making men soft, making women too alluring, and worst of all, draining the treasury. Because silk was not cheap. It was imported luxury, paid for in Roman gold. And like modern governments complaining about video games or avocado toast, the Senate decided silk was the downfall of civilization. Did people stop wearing it? Of course not. If anything, the complaints just made it more desirable. Because if the Senate is angry that your shirt is too fancy, you know you've made it. And that's where we'll pause this leg of the trip. From awkward beginnings to the Romans grumbling about shiny fabric, the Silk Road was already weaving its way into history. Next time, we'll drift further along, into the boom years of Silk Road trade, the rise of oasis cities, and the endless relay race of goods and gossip that tied the ancient world together. For now, just let yourself picture it. Caravans plodding through sand, silk tucked away in dusty saddlebags, some senator in Rome dramatically sighing about moral decay, all of it connected by threads of worm spit spun halfway across the world.